Joining me now is America's accountant, Dan Geltrude. Dan, thank you for being here. We witnessed back-to-back bank collapses. Let's start with Silicon Valley Bank on Friday. What advice do you give people when something like this is happening? How catastrophic is this situation? Should Americans be worried about the future of the banking system in the U.S.?
I would say concerned, of course, but not necessarily worried. And I think in order not to have a complete collapse here, people do need to stay calm. Look, what the president said, and I actually agree with him, is that the depositors in these banks must be protected. Now, the investors are another story, but the depositors have to be protected. And that means above that $250,000 FDIC insurance limit. And now the question is, well, why? Because if it becomes the case that the government will not be a backstop to our banking system, you will have runs on the banks. And if that happens, then you have the danger of the entire system collapsing. So it's really important right now to figure out exactly how widespread this problem is. And I doubt it's contained to just these couple of banks. I think that there are going to be other banks that there's some issues with. So we have to hope, and hope is never a good plan, but we have to hope that it's relatively contained, because the impact of it not being, well, that takes us back to 2008 when we really had a serious situation.
Now, in response to this, you've had all sorts of people chiming in. We have a tweet here from Mark Cuban as to what he thinks should be done about all of this. And he wrote that the Fed should immediately buy all of the securities and debt the bank owns at near par, which should be enough to cover most deposits, any losses paid for in equity and new debt from the new bank or whoever buys it. The Fed knew it was a risk. They should own it. Now, Dan, a lot of people do not like the response to this tweet, because what Mark Cuban is essentially saying is that that U.S. taxpayer dollars should go towards bailing this bank and these investors out. Do you see it that way, or do you think Mark Cuban has a good point?
Well, I think if you look at it from a system standpoint, we cannot allow the system to fail. I mean, it goes back to too big to fail. We are not at the point of too big to fail. And that's why I think the investors in these banks are going to have to bear those losses. Now, of course, if we end up with a systemic problem, then it becomes a different story. Again, I keep going back to 2008 because that's what everyone remembers. We were really on a very, very thin line to financial catastrophe. So when those bailouts occurred with taxpayer dollars, which no one likes, it was certainly worth it versus the alternative. In this particular case, Addison, we are not anywhere near that. So even though the president is talking about bank-funded federal insurance being used to protect those deposits, which is paid by the banks, ultimately bank customers are paying for that in the form of fees and interest and everything else. So it always comes back to the general public. In this case, it's just not directly to the taxpayers as it had been in 2008.
Now, I want to talk about Signature Bank as well. This is the second bank that faced financial collapse at the same time that SVB did. Signature Bank is a crypto-based banking system, Dan. How do you think this fares for the future of cryptocurrency? You know, we've seen the downfall of FTX. That was obviously because of some very bad, unethical business practices. What is to blame here with Signature Bank's crypto collapse as well?
Ironically, today, you have cryptos going up in value. And you may say, well, why would that make sense? Because crypto is what got them in trouble to start with. Well, you're looking at if the government is going to step in to be a backstop on cryptocurrency, well, that is somewhat like some insurance on your investment. Now, there are similarities between these two banks, both with Silicon Valley and with Signature. And it goes back to a similar issue, and that is the lack of diversity of who their customer base is. With Silicon, you were looking at they were primarily with all these startups, and Signature was really tied up with crypto. So like anything related to investing, diversity is key because you have to protect your downside. So now if you are going to get too lopsided in any investment, and things don't go well in the basket in which you've put all those eggs, then you're going to have a big problem. So that's where Signature is right now. Is that going to stop crypto? No, I think crypto is going to stay around, but are we going to see its meteoric rise that we saw in the past? I don't see that happening for some time.
Last question. Last question, Dan, because these two banks combined have Americans very concerned. Former President Donald Trump weighed in saying he thinks the U.S. is on its way to another Great Depression. How do you rank this claim? The Great Depression was trending on Twitter today. A lot of people are talking about it. Trump obviously being very critical of Joe Biden. Where do you come down on where we stand economically?
I think when we start talking about depression, that's an overreach right now, Addison, in my view. Look, there's a lot of emotion when you get involved in these types of financial occurrences, particularly when it concerns the banks, because that does bring back that historical moment of the Great Depression where the banks were failing. So I could understand why we need to at least think about it, but I don't think we're on that path right now. But I do think that the former president has a point related to, we really need to be paying attention of what's happening financially in this country. Raising interest rates, where the inflation is, and how these banks got caught up in the mess that they're in. I mean, do we have enough regulation? If the federal government is going to back this up, well, then we got to make sure that we're going to have diversity in what these banks are doing with their investments.
Well, a little bit of optimism for the American people from America's accountant, Dan Geltrude. Thank you as always for being here. Great to see you.
Thanks, Addison.